Okay, okay. It's time to begin. I am ready. Can't you tell? I am ready. What? Okay, we're in Isaiah chapter 41. Isaiah chapter 41. The nations God is putting on trial. One of the main arguments that God makes to show that he is the God of the universe is that when he says something and when it comes true, remember that I said it beforehand. He makes that argument all through this section actually Isaiah as a whole, but it really comes to bear in this chapter, in chapter 41, in pitting or showing God's superiority over the other gods and goddesses of the nations. None of them can do that. None of them can predict. None of them can see the future. And so when God makes a promise and it comes to pass, then you'll know that I am the Lord. That's what's constantly repeated, and that distinguishes God from all other gods, supposed gods. So I want us to pick up on that and be mindful of that, because that is the basis that God calls the nations into account in a legal dispute. So we'll be looking at the prophets like to do different things. As David's told us, Ezekiel is the drama prophet. You know, he likes to act out things, let people guess as to what he's doing. And then when they say, "What are you doing?" he says, "Well, let me tell you." Sometimes he's not allowed to speak. They can just guess. But other ways in which the prophets taught is they like to use a legal trial of the universe, you know. In fact, Isaiah begins that way. He says, "Come now, let us reason together." That's more of a, if you have a dispute, bring it forward. If you have something against me, this is your opportunity to raise it. And so God's going to give the nations an opportunity to come at him and file a lawsuit as to who he is and what he says. And then God counters. And, of course, God, being the prosecutor here, he's going to win because the nations don't have any legal footing to stand on. And that's one of the interesting things about chapter 41 that we'll see. In this chapter, and I take it to chapter 42 through verse 4, because I think that's the section cut off as far as what we have. Remember, the divisions of chapter and verses are not inspired. They were added for easy reference, quick moving through the scrolls and other types of codexes and books and everything. So they're just references. So they're not inspired. This is not where God said, "Okay, cut it off, make this chapter, and this is verse 1." It's easy to think that because it's in our Bible. And since we are such doggedly believers in the Bible, we could assume that the chapter divisions of verses are of God too. Now, maybe God played a providential hand in it. I don't know, but I don't think so, because some of the divisions are not very good. They destroy the train of thought. But for references, you can't beat it as far as locating chapter and verses. Otherwise, we would be like having an electronic book that has no pages, which my students buy a lot. And when I give assignments and tell them what pages to read, they're at a loss, because they don't have pages of reference. Yes.
The story is told about the person that made these chapter and verse divisions. He was riding on a horse, and apparently when the horse jumped is when he made
Yeah. Chapter 1. Yeah. Okay. This section, remember, it seems to me, I think, and to a lot of others, and it may not be the way that you understand it, but chapters 40 through 55 are dealing with the period of the exile. And so these are messages of encouragement. Sometimes the message is dealing with the period, in the middle of the exile where the people are discouraged and they're wondering how long this is going to happen. Sometimes it's a jump forward to the end of the exile. Sometimes we're dealing with the beginning. But just remember the background, it seems, of these chapters are the Babylonian, captivity. So the messages jump around as far as where you would place them, as in the beginning, at the end of the captivity, in the middle of the captivity. But understand that it doesn't really matter because we're dealing with that 70-year captivity, and these messages are meant to encourage the people in Babylon, and also it is a warning to the Babylonians and other nations, because in this section we start seeing the rise of a person from, the east, the north, that is going to be raised by God to punish the nations. He's going to be named later Cyrus. Okay, he's mentioned twice in Isaiah, but we're starting to get the prelude of the rise of the Persians. And this is what is being referred to here beginning in chapter 41. So this is what I have. The headings are just illustrating the different sections that I think are grouped together in the subjects that they deal with. In your Bible, you may have a space, a larger space, in between certain sections, which the translators, are thinking that, we have a different section here or what have you. So that's helpful a lot of times. Sometimes it's not, but I've sort of sectioned off what I think goes with what. So the first one is God raises up Cyrus to execute judgment against the nations. So Isaiah 41, verse 1. Coastlands, listen to me in silence, and let the peoples gain new strength. Let them come forward, then let them speak. Let us come together for judgment. Remember prophetic sarcasm, okay? Because what you might think, God's showing compassion or is showing some type of mercy to the nations. No, this is sarcasm. And he's calling them, he's giving them an invitation to come, as we'll see in just a minute. But this is God's execution of judgment against the nations. Now, the word nations is used. It's all nations. When God does something, it affects the cosmos and all the people of the world. The one particular nation that's under fire or in God's crosshairs is the Babylonians. You remember, he's already predicted earlier that once the Babylonians, do their thing that God wanted them to do, God's going to turn around and judge them for their sins, iniquity, and all that. He says, who has aroused one from the east when he calls in righteousness to his feet? He delivers up nations before him and subdues kings. He makes them like dust with his sword, as the wind-driven chaff with his bow. This is a reference to Cyrus and the rising of the nations. And notice how God is describing him. God, don't be concerned with words like attributed to him as righteousness. He's not talking about the sinlessness of the people. He's talking about God is using them. So in the instrument, they are acting righteously as his sword of judgment. Okay? He's not attributing them to their moral qualities of excellence. This is language that ultimately is a reflection of God using a nation for his purposes. But notice what he says about him. He's aroused one. This is the nation of the Persians, you see. that will become dominant upon the scene, which, by the way, is the third kingdom of Daniel chapter 2, right? And the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw. So God is raising up this one who is going to delivers up nations before him and subdues kings. He makes them like a dust with his sword. Okay, this is very graphic language about his strength and brutality. As the wind-driven chaff with his bow, he pursues them, passing on in safety by way he had not been traversing with his feet. This is an interesting phrase in Hebrew. It has the connotation almost as if you were watching Cyrus on his, it's like he's walking in air. He's so swift in the decapitation of all the nations. So he swiftly comes into dominance and swiftly overtakes Babylon and others, which is the description that the prophet is giving as you visually watch this aroused one from the east who is going to conquer the nations. He says, who has performed and accomplished it, calling forth generation from the beginning. The question is, or the issue is at stake here, yeah, we see the rising of this Cyrus, this nation, that's going to execute judgment against other nations, particularly the Babylonians. The prophet raises the theological question, which is what? What's the theological issue? What's the religious message? Who's behind it? That's the question. The theological answer is God is behind all of this. And he's telling you beforehand what's going to happen. Okay? So I, the Lord, am the first and the last. I am he. This is the one who is behind the one that's rising up to execute judgment, that everybody is fearful of. God is behind it. Just like God was behind the Babylonians in their execution of judgment, just like God is behind the Assyrians, in punishing North Israel, it's emphasized by the prophet now that God is the one that told everybody about it, and when it happens, remember, it was I who told you. It has happened. What does that prove then? There's no one like God, which is one of the messages of Isaiah. Okay. Picture now, we have the enemy of the Babylonians, Cyrus the Great coming, the Persians, and they're marching. Okay. They're marching westward, and they're going to get the Babylonians, conquer them, and conquer everybody else, all right? Now, if you're the Babylonians and you're the other nations and you see this mighty power, you're going to be somewhat afraid because you recognize this is a growing, powerful empire, right? So this is the reaction of the nations. The pagan nations, what do they do when they're afraid? What do they do when they're afraid? They band together and they start building and encouraging everyone to trust in their what? Their gods, their idols. So this is the description of how the nations react now to the rumor of the rising of the Persians who are coming to defeat everybody. Okay? So the coastlands have seen and are afraid. It's the same people that referred to in verse 1. He says they're afraid and the ends of the earth tremble. Okay? There's going to be rumors. There's going to be news. There's going to be catastrophes when the Persians begin their move against all the nations. They have drawn near and have come. Now, each one, this is the encouragement of the other nations against the Persians. Each one helps his neighbor and says to his brother, now, we got to be strong, okay? So the nations are going to band together, and they're encouraging one another, be strong, because you have the mighty Persians who are coming. So they're banding together. I mean, this is, they're fighting for survival now. They're getting ready. So they say, be strong. Then it says, in order to be strong, so the craftsmen encourage the smelters, and he who smooths metal with the hammer encourages him to beat the anvil, saying of the soldering, it is good. And he fastens it with nails so that it will not totter. What's he referring to? Idols. They're building idols. So they're saying, we got to get strong. Their answer in getting strong is, from their worldview, what they need to do, which is what we need to do, not go to idols and gods, but to God, right? They're doing what they believe is right, but they have the wrong God. So, in order to gain strength, they go to the superstition and the spirituality that they know as pagans, and they get really involved in producing idols. Okay? Because the idol, their God, its representative, is what ultimately is going to deliver them. All the nations back then, of course, have their idols, their gods, goddesses, their protectors. So they gotta raise up these gods to take note of them. It's just like in Jonah, okay? Jonah is told to go preach to Nineveh, right? What does he do? He goes the opposite direction. He gets on the ship going to Tarshish, okay? The Lord gets after him. Now, a big storm comes upon the sea that the Lord has hurled, by the way. He's the cause of it. And the people, the mariners, the sailors in the boat, they start doing what? They start beseeching each his God for help. What has Jonah done? Well, in contrast to that, Jonah shows no faith or trust or anything at all. I mean, there's such a contrast between the pagan sailors and supposedly a prophet of God who goes down in the boat, he falls asleep and doesn't care about anything. He's getting away from God. He knows he can't get away from God. I mean, God's not tied to any one location, but he's going to get God occupied. So God will forget about saving the Ninevites. Let's get God on this wild goose chase and let him get after me. He admits that in chapter 4, by the way, that he was forestalling the forgiveness of the Ninevites because he could not have God forgive these people. That's sad, isn't it? Yeah, that's a bad attitude, but that's what's going on. But the contrast between the sailors' attitude and what they're doing and Jonah's, that's one of the things that's emphasized. They're doing what they believe is right. Jonah is the opposite. He's not obeying God. He's not calling upon God. He's not doing God's will. Though he's a prophet, a Jew. He's doing everything other. So the mariners look more spiritual than he does because the mariners are also trying to save people on the boat who are about to, drown and crash if they don't lighten it because the waves are coming up. Jonah has fallen asleep. The word that's used for falling asleep actually refers to a almost comatose death sleep. It's almost as if he's just wishing for death. And it pictures him as falling fast to sleep. And it's not just that he's tired. Maybe he had a death wish. I don't know. But it's interesting what's the word that's used to describe that state. Okay, so here The reason I bring that up is to say, from all practical purposes, from their worldview, they're doing what's natural. They're involved in idols. This is the problem of false gods and false teachings. People think they're doing the right thing, and they're not. We may assume they're so spiritual, but they're not. How can you be spiritual if you're engaged in false religion? Who defines what is spiritual? So here the nations are building their idols. They're saying, be strong, our gods will save us. And God's going to say, I'm sorry, your idols are useless, you're dumb, you're stupid, I'm sorry. I'm coming to destroy you. And Cyrus is going to be my instrument. Now, before he gets to that, the nations turn to their idols. God then talks to his servant, Israel. Now, let me pause for just a minute. In this section, chapter 40 through 55, we have the theme of servant that comes up. And there are several who are called God's servant. Israel, Cyrus is called God's servant. And then we have an unknown ambiguous servant that we're going to mention in Isaiah 42. Now, the translators are interpreting for you. When they capitalize servant, the reason they're doing that is because they have interpreted this as being messianic. Why didn't they capitalize it when it says Israel, my capital S servant? They didn't do that. That's because the servant mentioned in 42, many take as being messianic, which I do too, but I think there's an original application. Be careful about that because translators are doing that. They're providing interpretation. Let the context tell you. The context seems to indicate that the servant is Israel. That's the one who's called servant first. But I say that Israel is going to foreshadow the true servant, Jesus. Okay? These verses that we have in chapter 42 and other places are used by New Testament writers and applied to the perfect servant, Jesus Christ. So they are messianic. But remember, we've been noticing, I think, a dual parallel type of thing. We have the immediate response to what's happening. And then underneath, you got this rising of this messianic fulfillment, ultimate, of these images and ideas that are fulfilled in Christ. Otherwise, you're going to have the problem that many have with Revelation. If you're a premillennial, you'll take everything as being future-oriented and nothing that addresses the first century. I think that can be a problem with reading some of the prophets like Isaiah. You can take it all messianic, and that's fine, because there are messianic allusions and applications. But what's the message to the people who are originally receiving this? You see? So, we have God emphasizes to the exiles that he is their Redeemer. He is their Redeemer. So he turns his mind from the nations building their idols to, buttress their strength against the rise and the dominance of the Persians. God is going to tell the captives in Babylon, don't be afraid. See, they don't know that Cyrus is going to let them go, do they? No, Cyrus to them is like another Nebuchadnezzar or another Sennacherib. They don't know yet until Isaiah begins to let them know, and the other prophets, Ezekiel and Daniel and all of them, they encourage the exiles, don't be afraid of what's happening and the rumors you hear, because God is your Redeemer. This is what he says next. He says, but you, here's the contrast, but you, Israel, my what? My servant. That needs to be highlighted, because we're going to see the theme servant, and you need to ask yourself, who is the servant that Isaiah is referring to? He says, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, in case we missed it the first time. Jacob is a representative of Israel, God's people, right? He says, and if you didn't get it that time, he says, descendant of Abraham, my friend. Remember, Abraham was called the friend of God, right? Yeah. So we have you whom I have taken from the ends of the earth, God reminds them, and called from its remotest parts and said to you, you are my what? Servants. Talking to Israel. You exiles. Don't forget, I chose you. I made you into a great nation. Yeah, you were punished before sin, but I haven't forgotten about you because I chose you. You're my servant. I have chosen you, and I have not rejected you, which would be easy for someone to think if they're in exile, Jerusalem has been destroyed, that God has rejected them. You know, well, that's not what punishment is it? True punishment is not a sign of rejection, but a sign of what? Love and care, right? You know, when I discipline my children, or when I was disciplined, it wasn't for discipline's sake. It was because someone cared enough for me to correct me. Well, that's the imagery. I mean, God's looked at as a father. The book of Hebrews illustrates that God uses circumstances as discipline. But see, as a teenager would, or somebody else, when they're disciplined, they think that we hate them. And that's not true. He says, continuing, do not fear. See, all the nations are what? Fearful of the rise of Cyrus and the Persians that are coming, but God tells his exiles not to fear. What's the next one? You ever heard of Emmanuel? I am with you. Okay. Do not anxiously look about you. Okay. What's the image here? Do not look anxiously about you. What's he discouraging them from doing? Don't panic. Don't pay attention to the rumors. Okay? Serve me. Know that I remember you. I haven't deserted you. I'm fully aware of what's going on. You're going to hear these rumors. You're going to hear, the rise, and they will come, and you will be there when Cyrus overtakes the Babylonians. But do not fear. Don't panic. Yes.
This Cyrus here is Cyrus the Great.
Yes.
Wasn't he very tolerant of religions that
Yeah.
he overtook?
Yeah.
Was that God's hand kind of guiding him to do that, especially?
I think God used him providentially, and it's probably in his nature. Maybe it was. God's behind it. Cyrus was the perfect one to rise up, and God names him because he had a different diplomatic policy of captives. He didn't take him into captivity per se. He allowed captured people to return home, stay where they are, and be faithful to the Persian Empire, which is a whole different way of looking at taking over foreign nations. But yeah, Isaiah has just indicated that God is behind it. And he's saying to them, okay, don't be afraid. Why? Because God knows that Cyrus is what? Going to have a different political response to captive people. They don't know that yet. But what's he calling the people to do who are in exile? Trust me, right? Isn't that interesting? God doesn't always give you all the facts, does he? He's telling us to trust him. Even when all else tells you that it's going to collapse and we're done. Jeremiah's already said 70 years in captivity, okay? who's going to be counting? Who remembers that? Go ahead. What?
A good example from the New Testament that we keep many times in summer things is when Peter asked Christ to let him step out on the water and walk to him.
Yeah.
Long as Peter was focused on Christ, everything was fine.
Right.
There was a storm that was all around. And we need to think about this before we be focusing on there's a storm coming around.
Yeah.
And so forth. We're concerned about any and everything. But when we trust God, all is well.
This is why the Old Testament is good for illustrations. You know, this is a good illustration for that, to remind them, to remind us. We have an example in the Old Testament. But it's hard to believe when you see things spinning out of control and the rumors and all that's happening around you, and God's just, trust me. I haven't abandoned you. I haven't forsaken you. I chose you. I love you. So this is him reiterating that he's going to be the Redeemer. So he continues. He says, do not fear, for I'm with you. Do not anxiously look about. Their answer is not in what are we going to do about this invasion? How are we going to survive? That's not the issue that's at stake here. It's so impractical from a worldly point of view. He says, for I am your God, I will strengthen you. Surely, notice it, surely, it's kind of like, duh, God says, I will help you. Do you not know that? He says, surely, again, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. What does the right hand of God symbolize? Yeah, when God's right hand raises and is extended. That's the theme that's used earlier in Isaiah to talk about God's execution of judgment. His hand is still outstretched. He's not through yet. It's power. He says, behold, all those who are angered at you will be shamed and dishonored. Those who contend with you will be as nothing and will perish. You will seek those who quarrel with you, but you won't be able to find them. Those who war with you will be as nothing and non-existent. What is he saying? Yeah. The Babylonians are going to be brought to nothing. Those who quarrel with you is a reference to those who war, or engaged in battle. This is not talking about disputes. It's talking about what the Babylonians did. So, God then says, for I am the Lord your God, who upholds you, who upholds your right hand. Now notice, whose right hand? Their right hand, signifying he's going to give them what? Strength, power to overcome this. Who says to you, do not fear, I will help you. Do not fear, you worm Jacob. Now this is not a term of sarcasm. It's a term of contrast between who Jacob is, Israel, and who God is. They're helpless without God, but since God is going to give them strength and come to their aid, they won't be helpless anymore, okay? Because God will be their Redeemer, their Savior. So he says, where am I? Do not fear. Notice he said it. He says, I'm the Lord who gives you strength. Do not fear. I will help you. Do not fear, you worm Jacob, you men of Israel. I will help you, declares the Lord. And your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. Now, this right here is a foreshadowing of Jesus. Who's the Redeemer? Jesus is. Who is the one who delivers us from sin. It's Jesus. So see, the allusions are galore in Isaiah and the applications to the work and ministry and identity of Jesus. He says, verse 15, behold, I have made you a new sharp threshing sledge with double edges. What does that mean? He says, you will thresh the mountains and pulverize them, and will make the hills like chaff. Now, this imagery is often alluded to Jesus, the one who has the double-edged sword coming out of his mouth, and all these kinds of things that the New Testament writers draw from to give us images of the conquering and victorious Christ. But notice what he says to them. This is Israel. I'm going to give you a new double-edged thresher so you can come to the mountains, and what are you going to do? Notice with God, everything is cosmic. You're going to knock down the mountains, right? You're going to pulverize them. Now, this is imagery that's going to, which is describing Judah's return home. How do I know that? This is what follows next. So he says, and make the hills like chaff. In other words, you'll get rid of what? Obstacles. Nobody's going to stand in your way. Now, there are those who tried. The Samaritans tried to stop and halt the rebuilding, the wall, and they had problems in there. But every crisis that arose, what happened? They were pulverized. The obstacles were done away with. Yeah. Yeah. They had letters, and they even, in fact, Cyrus gave them the materials. I mean, what empire does that? The Persian Empire did. Okay? So it's almost as like it was when they left Egyptian bondage. When they left Egypt, they left with what? Plunder of the Egyptians, didn't they? Yeah. When they leave Babylon, they leave with the plunder, so to speak. I mean, they're provided everything that they need to rebuild. Now, so a foreign power has given them the money, the materials to build their city. That's the Persian way. A much more respectable, dominant power, right? Yeah. They figured that out, that people would be more likely to serve them and not have rebellion on the outskirts because they were so benevolent with the captives. Now, they were vicious and cruel, too, with enemies, no doubt about it. So, we go to the next line, verse 18, I believe, 16. It says, you will winnow them, and the wind will carry them away, and the storm will scatter them. So this is the idea of pulverizing the mountains, get rid of the obstacles. But you will rejoice in the Lord. You will glory in the Holy One of Israel. Isaiah is the one who constantly uses this Holy One of Israel. Now, section 4 is a picture of their return home. This is to the people while they're still in exile, okay? Notice how the picture begins. He says, the afflicted and the needy are seeking water, but there is none. See, they're going through the wilderness now to get back home, right? He says, and their tongue is parched with thirst. These are some obstacles. These are practical obstacles that they're facing when they turn home and go home. They go through an arid land, which, the Carlyles will see, and much of Israel is. He says, I, the Lord, will answer them myself. As the God of Israel, I will not forsake them. I will open rivers on the bare heights and springs in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water and the dry land fountains of water. What's he saying to the exiles? who might even be a little hesitant about coming home because of the journey and the aridness of, the devastation of Jerusalem. How are they going to eat? I remember Jesus saying, what are we going to wear? What are we going to, put on? What all this? And he says, each day has enough trouble of its own. Seek first the kingdom. Right? So God says, I will be the one who aids you and helps you on your journey back home. He says, I will put the cedar in the wilderness, the acacia and the myrtle and the olive tree. I will place the juniper in the desert together, and the box tree and the cypress, that they may see and recognize and consider and gain insight as well. I think that's a great sermon there, that sometimes we need to pause and see, recognize, consider, and gain insight. Isn't that great? Yeah, absolutely. Now, he turns from showing that he's going to sustain Judah on their return home. Then he invites the nations now to present their case. Present your case, he says. The Lord says, bring forward your strong arguments. The king of Jacob says, let them bring forth and declare to us what is going to take place. As for the former events, declare what they were, that we may consider them and know their outcome, or announce to us what is coming. See his argument? God says, okay, I'm going to give you a chance. Who predicted what? Did you predict what happened in the past? Do you know what's coming around the corner? All this? And of course, it's all rhetorical. No. So he says, declare the things that are going to come afterward, that we may know that you are gods. Okay, if you really are serving a God, that God should have some omniscience about him, knowing things that have happened and predicted it and were fulfilled, knowing things that are and knowing things that will happen in the future. Indeed, do good or evil, that we may anxiously look about us and fear together. God's being sarcastic here. Show us. And if it's shown, we'll all stand in awe and fear and respect of your gods. You see the sarcasm? He says, behold, the word behold is immediacy. It's an interjection saying, pay attention. You're of no account. That's the judgment against the idols, these false gods. And your work amounts to nothing. All the hoblob and the sorcery and all this stuff that you guys and gals do, it's pathetic. It means nothing. He who chooses you is an abomination. Not only are you nothing, but it's sad that so many would choose to serve and follow you. He says, I have aroused one from the north, another illusion, and he has come. From the rising of the sun, he will call on my name, and he will come upon rulers as upon mortar, even as the potter treads the clay. Now, calling on my name is not meaning that Cyrus is going to become a believer. It means that he's fulfilling what God wants him to do. He's God. He's going to be God's servant, whether he realizes it or not. He says, who has declared this from the beginning, that we might know, or from former times that we may say, he is right? See the question now? Your gods couldn't predict phooey. Your gods can't see anything. Now contrast that with me. Who told you that this was going to happen? Who told you that what has happened was going to happen? And who's telling you now that what's going to happen will happen? And when you see it fulfilled, you'll know that I'm the only God of the universe.
And the extra special thing about this is everything that God said came.
Oh, yeah.
He predicted something to happen at such and such time. It happened at that time.
Yeah.
There are people even today that sometimes are called prophets because maybe they get two things out of 10, 15, even 100,
Mm,
and they look at it, oh, he was
yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, we can get lucky every now and then. I mean, clock is what? You can be twice right predicting the time on a clock. But God, he's right all the time. Our time's up. We'll finish this next time. Thank you.